Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's program. It's time for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I hope that you've all got your lunch because it's time to do some discovering. For today's program, look, we've got an exciting one for you because every now and then the folks in the Office of Environmental Education actually they bring us some programs that are just intersecting in all kinds of great ways with what's happening here at the museum. Our offices are right next door to ours. In fact, even this program itself is a great collaboration between our two institutions, the Office of Environmental Education and the Museum of Natural Sciences. But for today, it's awesome because we're going to be talking with someone who knows a whole lot about mushrooms. And guess what? The theme happens to be for Saturday's big event here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, Darwin Day. The theme for Darwin Day happens to be fungus, of which I think mushrooms are going to play a pretty big and central role. And I see today's guests are just fist pumping because they're so excited. We're excited too. Folks here at the museum, I have to shout out Cindy Lincoln, who has done a tremendous amount of work bringing amazing fungus people into the museum for this Saturday. I imagine maybe even had a role in today's guest speakers and in next week too, because we're going to be doing mushrooms and fungus again next week here on the Lunchtime Discovery program and the events team at the museum. So look, we're doing it's all out fungus party today on the Lunchtime Discovery series, and then again Saturday from 10 to 5 on site here in downtown Raleigh at the Museum of Natural Sciences. For Darwin Day, we've got dozens of scientists, exhibitors, vendors, and programs and activities for you to participate in here at the museum. Some of those programs, we're going to live stream a presentation at 2:30 on Saturday. Anyway, naturalsciences.org is going to be your source for all of the information about what's happening at Darwin Day. But reeling it back into today's program with the Lunchtime Discovery series, of course, I would like you all to meet today's special guest speaker who's going to take us on a journey of mushroom hunting and education. Folks, say hi to Anna McHugh. Anna is an avid mushroom hunter, particularly in and around the Triangle, and has a YouTube channel that I'm interested in checking out where we can learn about mushroom ID and more. Anna, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much. It is a delight to be the first wave of mushroom people, to be sharing some of our passion. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, on both.
All right. Outstanding. Well, welcome everyone. Really deeply appreciate, everybody at the Department of Environmental Quality and the NC Museum of Natural Sciences for having me for this live stream. So I'm going to get right into it. Can't encourage you enough to check out some of the events, that these great organizations bring together for us. But I'm going to give you sort of a quick overview of the mushroom appreciation from my perspective. And, as was mentioned, I view myself as a avid mushroom hunter and mushroom appreciator. Some of my friends actually call themselves mushroom botherers, which I just love. And so mycology is a really rich and elaborate science. But there's a lot of points of entry as, somebody who just loves to spend time in the woods and loves to, photograph and document and then learn about, unusual organisms. There is tons of, diversity that you can study and also ways that you can get involved with the citizen science, which is really critical to mycology overall. So I'm going to give you a quick view of our agenda. First of all, I want to talk about mushroom basics. So what are they? Where do they live? And how do you find them? And a lot of, the great joy that I derive from mushroom hunting and my mushroom adventures is observing the habitats where mushrooms grow. And so I love being able to become familiar with trees and the way that water and, sunlight moves throughout an ecosystem, because that teaches me where and gives me a sense of where I might want to look for those mushrooms in the future. And so, learning where mushrooms live and what they prefer to associate with is a big part of enjoying your encounters and making it more likely that you'll find things. Then I'm going to talk about foraging a little bit. I started mushroom hunting with an interest in foraging. As time has gone on, I'm going to be quite blunt. I've become more and more, captivated by finding unusual and beautiful mushrooms to take photos of. And I also do mushroom illustrations. But that said, there's some really wonderful edible fungi that grow in North Carolina, and I'll cover a few of them. And then I want to talk about taxonomy and lifelong learning. As I mentioned, mycology is elaborate and very deep. The further you go, the less you know, I think is really the, watchword for a lot of us. And so, I have sort of an approach to learning the scientific classification and absorbing new research in a way that's sort of steady as she goes. I try to, learn a few mushrooms really, really well, and then kind of keep track of their lineage, because we have a lot of change in how we describe these organisms and their relationships between one another. Then I'm going to talk about a few of my favorite mushroom species, and finally talk about sort of ways that you can enjoy and appreciate mushrooms outside of foraging for them and outside of strictly being interested in identification. But let's, I'm going to explain very, very quickly why I'm here. So I am not a formally trained mycologist. I work at a tech company doing information architecture, and so classification of information is really interesting, and I enjoy doing it. And then it brings together this passion that I have for nature, and this enjoyment that I have also in walking through the woods at a slower pace. And so, I'm able to not just observe mushrooms, but again, observe the other organisms in those habitats and kind of understand how those relationships evolve. As such, I can give you some identifications, but some mushrooms are really hard to identify. So this is a great example of where my limitations are. So there is a genus called Russula. You will see a lot of them actually this time of year. So they are oftentimes very brightly colored, often like a really consistent red cap. Sometimes they will have pinky stems like these. Oftentimes they're white and they have white brittle gills underneath. Most importantly, they explode on impact. They're very, very brittle. However, there are many hundreds of Russula mushrooms. And so at a certain point, I usually say, okay, I'm going to cap myself. This is a red Russula mushroom, and I'm going to leave it at that. So, to that point, I make mushroom art and videos. If you're interested in some of my ID stuff, I welcome you to take a peek. But, the long and short is I make really lousy bread. And so when COVID came, I decided to commit myself to learning my East Coast mushroom species a good bit better than I had before. So I picked up the mushroom hunting hobby in the Pacific Northwest. And once you cross the Rocky Mountains and once you head into the Southeast, the profile of your species changed radically, because your trees, your wet and rainy season totally are different. So I started in Oregon, where mushroom season is in the fall. And then, down here in the Southeast in North Carolina, we really start to see our first good flushes of mushrooms in, June or so. And then they taper off, unfortunately, around this time of year. All right, I'm going to have a sip of water, and let's talk about mushroom biology basics. Okay, first of all, for those who are not familiar at all with the fungal kingdom, there are a whole stinking lot of species, probably around 5.1 million of them. Many, many, many of those species do not, produce mushrooms whatsoever. And so, there is a large grouping and category of, basically fungi that produce these fruiting bodies. And so besides that, you have molds, you have yeast, all kinds of other stuff going on. But within the fungi that produce mushrooms, they all have the common characteristic. They produce basically their real body is called mycelium. And it's a fine network of cells. It grows through wood and other organic material. And as it does so, it basically exudes digestive juices out into its environment, digests things, and then pulls it back into the mycelial network. And then it, uses that nutrition to grow more, to interact with its plant or tree partners, all the different fun things that fungi do. And so, mushrooms themselves are just the biological expression of the fungal body. It's just fruit. And so when the conditions are right, the mycelium will produce what's called primordia. So they're just these little, well, they start out as knots of, these little small pieces of mycelium called hyphae, and you get a whole huge cluster of them, and then they turn into what's called a primordia, and that's a little baby mushroom. And so as mushrooms mature, no matter what form they take, and they may take lots and lots of different forms, they develop structures to expel spores into the environment. And, you know, once spores land on things, then they can germinate. Spores can mate with each other. You have a lot of really interesting and very diverse ways that spores can recombine with one another. So the long and short is mycelium makes mushrooms. It throws all of these spores out into the wind, or, you know, mammals or, you know, insects will eat and transport spores in order to create new mycelial networks. So with mushrooms, the thing that's really important when you're identifying them is figuring out what their lifestyle is, meaning what they eat. So I was talking about mycelium and how it grows through its environment. You have a couple of different ways that mycelium will feed itself. So like animals, you know, fungi, they breathe oxygen, they exhale carbon dioxide, and they also need to get nutrition or food from their habitat. They have no photosynthetic activity, so they have to find food somewhere. So the first category, and when you're trying to identify mushrooms, kind of figuring out what that lifestyle is, what the mushroom is eating, is really, really helpful for identification. So I'll give you a couple of markers for how you would tell what lifestyle a species that you've encountered has. So first of all, we have our decomposers, also known as saprobes. And you'll see these in the form of oyster mushrooms very frequently. That's probably one of the most iconic wild mushrooms that you'll find in the North Carolina Piedmont in the wintertime. Come New Year's, there seems to be this massive blossom of them. And so you'll see them growing off of dead and dying wood. So they have a decomposing you know, action. Essentially, they have a lot of enzymes that they pump out, and they can actually decompose and break down wood, which is a pretty unusual, you know, trick. It's a very, you know, we can't eat wood. It takes some pretty hardy enzymes. So you have your decomposers. Some of them do grow on wood. Others do grow on the ground in things like leaf litter or, you know, wood chips, etc. So if you see a mushroom growing on wood, more than likely it is a decomposer. And that's really helpful. That can give you a sense of where you're going identification-wise. If you find a mushroom growing on the ground, you have to kind of figure out if it's growing sort of superficially on the top of the soil or in leaf litter or on, you know, very frequently like on buried sticks, or if it is growing in association with a tree or a plant. And that really takes just looking around and getting familiar also with other features of the mushroom. We also have our parasites, and parasites, you know, I was talking about oyster mushrooms. They can be both parasitic and a decomposer. We also have honey mushrooms. This is pictured on the slide here, Armillaria malea. It is an edible mushroom that is highly parasitic, you know, to trees and plants. And interestingly enough, I also have another parasite of a totally different kind on the slide. So Armillaria malea, it parasitizes all kinds of trees and plants, and it sends out these burly sort of rhizomorph, bootlace looking things, and it just strangles stuff. It's awful. But there's also a mushroom species called Emptiloma abortivum that will parasitize the actual fruiting bodies, the honey mushrooms, and turn the honey mushrooms into this weird thing that people call shrimp of the woods. And I'm pretty picky about my wild mushrooms, and this is a delightful and delicious mushroom that really does taste like shrimp. So you have parasites that are parasitizing wood and plants. You also have mushrooms and fungi that parasitize one another. It's an elaborate dance. And so I can't go too deeply into that, but that is you know, another lifestyle to look out for. Mycorrhizal mushrooms is the next one. So these are mutualists. And these are the mushrooms I am the most interested in when it comes to my mushroom hunting adventures. So mycorrhizal mushrooms grow in association with a tree or a plant partner. The thing that's really, really fun to me is that a lot of mushroom species are very particular about what their tree or plant, what they will buddy up with. And the relationship you have going on essentially is, you know, the plant or the tree will provide photosynthetic sugars to the fungus. And the fungus, the mycelium, will sort of grow and sheath parts of the root system of the tree. And so essentially the fungus is sucking down these sugars because it can't make its own. And in return, it supplies a lot of moisture, water, and thereby minerals to the tree. And so there's a lot of fascinating research about the mutually beneficial relationships between mycorrhizal mushrooms and their trees and plant buddies. And then you have blended lifestyles. And so these are, mushrooms are just highly adaptable and they do all kinds of unusual things. So I started by talking about how oyster mushrooms are a decomposer. Well, yes, but they also are parasitic, as I mentioned. Additionally, sometimes oyster mushrooms, if they are surrounded by nematodes and other little microscopic bugs, it will pump out this really weird sort of orangey yellow metabolite that will paralyze these little microscopic bugs, and then the oyster mushroom, Pleurotus austriatus, will consume them. So occasionally it is actually carnivorous. All right, so let's talk about mushroom hunting more generally and sort of safety considerations, because I always want people to be really mindful that like mushroom appreciation is a very, very safe thing to do, even if you start to eat wild mushrooms in, over the course of time. And so I want to talk to you first of all about wild mushroom poisoning and all the hullabaloo about safety. So first of all, the United States is very, very notably not as fond of mushroom hunting as a hobby as many other places in the world. There's just a lot of fear and concern around mushrooms. It always is kind of amusing to me when I'm around mushrooms, and many of them are toxic. And so, I'm not trying to denigrate the need to be safe, but there are also a whole lot of plants that are very toxic. And then there are the copperheads and a lot of other things that are, potentially problematic you have to protect yourself from. So anyway, we have fewer than 3 fatalities every year in the United States due to mushroom poisoning. This is between 1999 and 2016. So it's a very, very small number. And then when you are looking at the 2 genera that are the most dangerous, so you have Amanita mushrooms. That includes the death cap mushroom and the destroying angel mushroom. Those are kind of the 2 common names you want to put in your head and associate with dangerous Amanita mushrooms. And then also Galerina mushrooms. They're a little brown dude that grows on wood. It has the same sort of toxins in it. And so both of those, you have less than a 10% mortality rate. It's still an awful experience. It can do a lot of, liver and kidney damage, but liver damage in particular. And so, it's not to say that you shouldn't be extremely cautious when eating wild mushrooms. But it is also important to note that a lot of times when people talk about, poisoning events or toxicity, a lot of mushrooms will make you feel really, really crummy for a day or two. And it's important to avoid those. But typically when we're talking about mushroom poisoning, we're talking about gastrointestinal upset of one kind or another. Also, a lot of the, reported poisonings that we have in people who present at the ER with potential mushroom poisoning, it's precautionary because, if your kid eats a handful of unknown mushrooms in the yard, for sure, you're going to go to the ER. I'm going to drink some water and we will carry on. All right, let's talk about foraging. These are just a couple of things. I'm not going to linger here. But if you're interested in, getting help identifying mushrooms, Mushroom Facebook is a very, very helpful place. I really hate to talk about Facebook and I'm like, this is a thing that you should do. But when it comes to finding, interest groups and mutually knowledgeable identifiers, there are some really, really good groups on that particular social media network. If you do decide to participate in that, or iNaturalist is another great application and resource to get community and share your observations, you want to take pictures of your mushrooms from multiple angles. So you want to here's a turkey tail mushroom I want to show you. So basically this is a polypore mushroom. It doesn't have gills underneath. It's just sort of a porous, almost sandpapery surface. So if I were taking a picture for a forum, I would want to make sure that I get the bottom part that shows this porous layer, but also the top part that shows this nice variegated furriness and sort of like overlapping flowery thing. So you just want to make sure you get a picture from multiple angles. Sometimes I actually turn my camera almost diagonally and then I crop it and align it. And sometimes I can get a little more of like cap and underneath, but there are a lot of ways to do it. When you're hunting mushrooms, it's really a good idea to look up the hill instead of down the hill. And so you'll become familiar with mushroom colors, but mushroom shapes also start to really jump out when you practice. And so looking up the hill, you'll see these little adorable mushrooms of, fungi that are sort of bursting out from, the leaf litter. And that's really fun to do. So that looking up the hill can actually help you a good bit as far as your success. Plucking mushrooms is okay. So some people are concerned that if you pluck a mushroom in its entirety and don't cut it off at the base, that it will do a lot of damage to the mycelium. There's about 57 years of research that demonstrates that it is really kind of an inconsequential thing, whether you pluck or cut. The main thing is to be a good steward of, the habitats that you're in. And I also only, like if I'm foraging, I only take what I can reasonably eat or process in a couple of days. And that's ultimately not that many mushrooms, like this basket that you see on the screen. That's about my upper limit for what I can, eat or process in a fairly short period of time. And then I also take things that, are what I want to study. And I take those mushrooms in their entirety. Going back to plucking, it's important if you want to identify a mushroom, not only to take pictures from multiple angles, but to collect the whole fruiting body. Because there's a lot of mushrooms where what's going on at the base of the stem is super, super important for an ID. If you're going, honestly, it's important not to poison yourself. But for me, the thing I am the most concerned about is getting lost, because I've done it before. It's terrifying. This is definitely something that is, as far as risky things with mushroom hunting, not to be trifled with. And then other, like quasi-catastrophic things like losing my keys. And I have been on mushroom hunts where people have lost their keys, and it's really, really bad. So secure your scene, be very clear where you are. All right, so let's talk about taxonomy for a moment. If you're not super familiar with it, essentially we're just talking about the tree-shaped scientific classification for all kinds of critters, from us to the mushrooms. And so from the fungal kingdom, we have different layers of categorization all the way down to genus and species. And when I'm trying to help people sort of get their heads around it, I say, okay, don't focus too much on like learning individual species. There's some that you'll see so often that is a really practical approach. But what you want to do if you're trying to learn as many mushrooms as possible, I really recommend learning to genus. So sometimes that will give you essentially a gestalt of what certain mushroom types look like. And that can really accelerate your learning. Oftentimes also the scientific names are like, unlike some other biological, or naturalist sciences and hobbies, mushroom hobbyists will often use scientific names. A couple of reasons for this. First, a lot of these suckers have no common names, and that's just a pain in the bum. And so it's like, okay, the Latin is just sort of an amalgamation of different, random Greek and Latin and assorted, miscellaneous words. But, oftentimes that is a barrier, as we don't even have a common name. But secondly, at a certain point in my own journey learning about mushrooms, I realized the scientific names were going to help me create categories that would accelerate my learning. So learning a genus and then its scientific name gives me a sense sometimes even of the relationship between it and related genera. So, if you're trying to think of a method to sort of, open the box and learn and go down the taxonomy rabbit hole the way that this little worm went into a small mica cap mushroom, that is something that I would recommend. That said, don't freak yourself out. Mushrooms are like goth kids. They change their names all the time. And so, just don't stress out about it. Some people get very uptight about like, well, it was, this name last week and it'll be this name next week. And that's just because we're doing a lot of research and genetic analysis, and that's awesome. All right, so as I said, like just relax, learn, things will change back. Here's a great example of a mushroom I love, and I personally call it the red wrinkled flabbergaster because it's just so dramatic and over the top. It's also known as frost bolete, but it changed from Exudoporus frostii to a new genus called Butyrrhiboletus frostii, and then back to Exudoporus frostii. So essentially, you just have to, I follow it kind of like I would follow sports. I enjoy it, but I don't try too hard. All right, so let's talk about different mushrooms that are common in the southeastern U.S., and then I will try to take questions in just a few minutes, about 20 minutes. All right. So I am going to talk about my culinary preferences, and I want to be very clear that those are highly subjective, and there are a lot of reasons that I'm just not a very good cook, and so sometimes a mushroom that takes varied heat or a lot of ingredients or separating out many different pieces that require being cooked at different rates, I'm not the person to talk to. And I'm also not going to talk about the medicinal value of mushrooms because I'm simply not qualified. But when I talk about mushrooms in general, I place them from an edibility perspective on what I call the hot pocket scale. So the question for me when I find a mushroom in the woods is this going to be more or less satisfying than a hot pocket? And if the answer is more, then I will probably pick it, see if it is, bug free, and then bring it home with me. If not, I'm going to put it in that category of like, okay, I know that I could potentially eat this if things get really dire. If I run out of hot pockets, I know where to go. So again, this is all highly subjective, but I do have some icons that I use on the slides that follow about sort of the culinary merits or the different characteristics of the mushroom species I cover. So first of all, I have mushrooms that I consider to be edible and tasty. So as I was saying, there are mushrooms that I consider to be, yummy mushrooms, and then mushrooms that are edible, but I don't personally enjoy. And I'm hedging a little bit here because there are lots of different preferences. Like just this morning, I found a mushroom that I'm like, I don't really ever think I will try to eat this, even though it's listed as edible. And somebody almost immediately was like, this is one of the best mushrooms in this genus. So, there are lots of times there are mushrooms I don't even try eating because I have the edibles that I want. And that's a wonderful thing about North Carolina. There is no shortage of mushrooms to taste and try. So we have edible and tasty. I labeled mushrooms that I, don't typically eat or I don't enjoy with a spam label. Then you have mushrooms as well that are inedible. So they're woody or corky. And so, you could chew on them, but you wouldn't be able to actually eat them and get any, sort of benefit from it. Now, I also have some adverse reactions here. We have uncommon adverse reactions, so mild GI distress, more, common ones, extreme GI upset. And so like you have sort of a range between like some people get some belly rumbles to a good number of people really lose their cookies to it is a very explosive situation. Those are that's the range of like mushroom sick in general. And then you have your potentially deadly mushrooms, which contain toxins that are very specifically really bad for your liver and other body parts. I also added notes for tree associates, because most of these are mycorrhizal mushrooms, so they associate with a tree or plant. So we have oak mushrooms and beech mushrooms. There are a lot of mushrooms that grow with pine, but I'm not going to go into that too deeply. All right, so let's start out with chicken of the woods. This is a species group, so we have a number of different species that you can find in the forests of North Carolina. The most common of which is called Ladypora cincinnatus, commonly called the white chicken of the woods. And it is a mushroom that often grows in these big rosettes on the ground on sort of buried wood material. So this is a great example of a decomposing mushroom that will grow on substrate that is just below the surface of the soil. So you'll oftentimes find it like there will be a log, and then right next to it, you'll find this big rosette of a chicken of the woods. But you will also see it growing directly on wood as well. If you're interested in eating this mushroom, I must caution you, it is one of those, like it is on the one hand, one of the most popular edible mushrooms because it really does have an uncanny poultry flavor to it, but it also is one of those mushrooms that a lot of people are sensitive to and they get sick. Not like really, really sick, but adequately sick that I am always kind of just aware that, some people, it does not agree with them. That said, when the mushroom is nice and sort of a pinky orange color on the top and nice and white and porous underneath, it can be a really, really delicious edible mushroom. You can see that it has these beautiful sort of concentric growth zones of color. And so it's sort of almost salmon-y orange pink with these lighter zones on the outside. And you can sort of harvest them in strips, essentially, especially if your specimen is a little more mature and it is a little tougher. So, it'll grow on the ground. It grows also on wood. And when it's really, really fresh, if you cut one of these Ladypora cincinnatus at the base, it will soak your hands in this whitish tinged water. It's very dramatic, and that means that the mushroom is very, very tender and quite delicious. However, the problem with this mushroom is that it gets these chemically off flavors that develop relatively quickly. So when you see Ladypora cincinnatus in sort of looking far more orangey and far more flat, like the one you see on this slide here, oftentimes it is sort of stringy and fibrous and has this sort of like gross chemical flavor thing going on. And so, you just want to be aware that like if the mushroom is nice and tender, chances are it'll have a very lovely sort of chickeny flavor, and it's uncanny chickeny. The degree to which it tastes like poultry. But as they get older, it can become a really underwhelming experience. So on this slide, you'll see the other species that you can potentially find, Ladyporus gilbertsonii and Ladyporus sulphureus. We also have, Ladyporus huroniensis. That is a northern, chicken of the woods mushroom that grows with conifer, and it can cause a lot of gastrointestinal upset and sickness. And so sometimes you'll hear people say, don't eat chicken of the woods that grows on pine, and that is typically why, is actually that species that grows on pine. So anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here. We also have a couple of other edible mushrooms that look similar to chicken of the woods. So they have this sort of porous undersurface. They're big and leafy. And these mushrooms, I guess I haven't really established scale. So they can be anywhere between, a pound or two to, sometimes 10, 15 pounds. They can really get sizable. So we have the black staining polypore. So that's called Meropilus sumstenea. And I may have butchered the Latin pronunciation there. Sumstenea, I think. Anyway, this is a similar, sort of flowery looking mushroom. It stains radically black when you damage it, but it is similarly, some people really like to eat it. We also have another one that doesn't stain, that's sort of a drab tan color, and that's called Berkeley's polypore, or Bondarzewia berkeleyi is the scientific name there. All right, so we've talked a little bit about our chickens of the woods. Key takeaways, you can find them sort of starting in May, like the Ladypora cincinnatus comes out really before the beginning of chanterelle season, which typically would begin in June, in the Raleigh area. And I say typically because this year we didn't really have a June mushroom season. It was too dry. But you'll oftentimes see those Ladypora cincinnatus come out in May, and then you'll see them sort of periodically throughout the year. As it gets colder, they will shut down their activity. All right, let us move on to Cantharellus mushrooms. So this is chanterelles. We have a whole stinking load of different chanterelle species, and to identify them in the field can be very difficult without microscopy and without a lot of understanding of some species that are either undescribed or just very, very difficult to tell apart. So it's kind of a cryptic area in a weird way as far as getting beyond the genus name, which is Cantharellus. However, chanterelle mushrooms are probably one of the easiest mushroom sort of groups to eat and identify that are very, very common in the North Carolina Piedmont as well. And so, they fruit, as I mentioned, sort of beginning in June. I see them oftentimes until the first or second week of October. They are definitely done by now, unfortunately. And they have essentially underneath, and you can see really clearly on this peachy colored one on the right-hand side, a sort of wrinkled and forked undersurface. So those are called false gills. Mushrooms that have sort of a blade-like surface underneath, that is what's called a gill. And so Cantharellus mushrooms have false gills, which are, again, wrinkly and forked, and they are fairly easy to sort of scrape off with a fingernail. Cantharellus velutinus is a large sort of peachy colored chanterelle mushroom that has really distinctive sort of these wrinkles that also are decurrent, meaning they run down the stem a little bit. And oftentimes as chanterelles get mature, they have this sort of like a vase shape and a lot of floweriness. They're not very determinate. So, a lot of mushrooms, they are asymmetrical, and from the perspective of someone who likes to draw them, they're very forgiving because mutation and irregularity is the norm. All right, so we do have chanterelle mushrooms that are more of an egg yolk color. Some of them have white stems, some of them have, they're sort of orangey yellow all over. However, when you open up the mushrooms, they have nice firm white flesh. It's kind of like string cheese in consistency. And all of them have these false gills that run down the stem a little bit. Some of them have a nice fruity smell and some of them don't. So, some field guides will that are more like West Coast focused will talk a lot about an apricot smell that chanterelles have. And we have some that have that aroma and some that don't. So that's not a key indicator. But one of my favorite things about mushroom season is seeing the cascade of different chanterelle species throughout the year because they overlap. We have some that are just gorgeous peach colored ones that I'm totally obsessed with, at least in 2022. All right, so as far as what you should look for in chanterelle patches is also the Hydnum genus. So these are hedgehog mushrooms, and they're my personal favorite. They grow with oak. They also grow with beech, and they're a tree. Beech trees are great mushroom trees, but Hydnum mushrooms are really easy to identify. They have a nice nutty flavor, and there's about 17 different species of them. So like chanterelles, you can get a really good idea of what a hedgehog mushroom looks like and eat it safely. But if it gets to like which specific species it is, unless you have a microscope and some DNA analysis and maybe a willingness to say this has never been described by science, you are sometimes forced to stop at the genus level. So we see them in June all the way through October, and a few of them into the winter time. It is a long season. They're not super prolific though. So, you'll typically find small clusters of them. Chanterelle patches can be just ginormous and stretch for acres, but, you'll find hedgehog mushrooms oftentimes sort of sprinkled in there in little clusters. So the thing that's important about identifying hedgehog mushrooms is, first of all, they tend to be sort of a whitish or creamy color. Oftentimes they stain brown or orange when you handle them. So the mushroom you can see on the right of the slide has a sort of brown orange, more on the brown side, staining reaction. And that's just from handling it a little bit. And the other thing that's really important to note about hedgehogs and how they get their common name are these adorable little dentines, these little teeth. And so they're pretty delicate, but instead of having false gills or real gills or a porous layer or a spongy layer, you have little teeth that hang down the bottom. Now we have a couple of mushrooms that look reasonably similar to hedgehogs, but one is the Sarcodon genus. It's very, very bitter typically, and it's also a very different color, so more like blackish gray. And then we also have Hydnellum mushrooms, which are very corky, so that you wouldn't mistake them because they aren't a fleshy mushroom that you could really eat. So this is one of my absolute favorites. And because there are so many of them throughout the year, I just get a kick out of, again, watching the succession of species in North Carolina is just mind-blowing, because it's like chanterelle season means a season for a lot of different chanterelle mushrooms. All right. Let's talk about ringless honey mushrooms. This is a very common one. Some people eat it. I personally don't. And that is oftentimes like an abundance thing. I have plenty of wild mushrooms that I can eat, and so I typically don't go after this one. But ringless honey mushrooms are super duper common. You'll see them go off like a bomb in September, and they grow pretty much anywhere that they can attack a tree or a plant. So you'll see them in yards in these massive bouquets and clusters of brownish mushrooms that oftentimes, like as they mature, their gills will start to really get wrinkly and roll, come down the stem a little bit. But they, I think we had a fruiting of them in Raleigh last week as well. So, they prefer sort of cooler weather, but like that, middle fall weather that we have that's a little bit on the warm side. So, they're highly parasitic. They just choke everything around them. They're really awful in a lot of ways. But you know, nonetheless, it is like, if you're familiar with mushrooms, and more to the point, if people that love you are familiar with the fact that you're into mushrooms, this is the one you will get pictures of, because they're so conspicuous. They grow in these, you know, right in the front of people's yards, right next to their trees, these giant honking bouquets of mushrooms with very fibrous stems and sort of brownish caps with oftentimes little black fibrils, or, you know, fibrous bits on the top of them. And again, some people eat them. It is recommended that you boil them before you then cook and eat them. All right, I'm running out of time, but I do want to talk about a few of my favorites. This is a summertime mushroom called Areoboletus betula, also known as the shaggy stalked bolete. It is a really distinctive mushroom that is also characteristic of bolete mushrooms in general. So when I say bolete, what I mean is a mushroom that it has a spongy undersurface. So it's sort of a porous layer, but if you split the mushroom's cap, you'll see a sponge. It almost looks like a whale's baleen, so it's a little thick. Definitely in contrast to a polypore, which has a porous undersurface, but it is just an undersurface. There's no like sponge there. So Areoboletus betula is really common in the summertime. It's sort of this red color on the stem, and has these really distinctive and very big shaggy yellow overlay, essentially, of you know, on the stem. And then a cap that varies between a sort of yellow, like lemony color, to a reddish color. So great mushroom to find, and definitely one that I recommend if you're interested in, you know, foraging for mushrooms that are beautiful to find and fairly easy to identify, because there's just not much that looks like that. I was talking about boletes a moment ago. Here's just a slice of the variability that we have. We have a lot of different genera of these spongy underbottom mushrooms. So we have Retiboletus, which is a beautiful mushroom that has reticulation, meaning these interlocking sort of fishnet appearance on the stem. It's really gorgeous. We have Tylopilus, which is oftentimes sort of purple, or you know, a lilac color, but sometimes is bright orange in the case of the Tylopilus that is on the extreme right of the screen. And then, just for grins, here's a Phylloporus, excuse me, mushroom known as the gilled bolete. So this is a great example. This is the mushroom on the far left. It is a very common edible mushroom that is more closely related to these spongy bottom mushrooms than the gilled mushrooms that it looks like. So as per normal, fungi are perplexing. And so, you know, a common name like the gilled bolete literally is a contradiction in terms. We also have Lactarius indigo group. This is a mushroom that I find edibility-wise to be pretty mediocre, but it's so fun to find, and it's really fun to draw. So it's this, you know, sort of light blue, almost silvery blue mushroom with these gorgeous concentric growth zones on the top. And when you damage it, it bleeds this prodigious bluish juice. It looks like you had a, you know, knife fight with a Smurf or something when you're, you know, done playing around with them. And so when you damage the gills, and you can see this very clearly in the photograph, you get this very dark indigo blue. It's called latex. And so the Lactarius genus produces latex, and sort of that latex is a, you know, colored sometimes, but it's sort of a milkyish, you know, material, or milkyish liquid. In the case of Lactarius indigo group, and that's about 4 species, maybe 5, you have a lot of them that are just really, you know, spectacular to find and play around with because of that coloration. All right, let's talk about Amanita bisporigera and other white amanitas. So these are really poisonous mushrooms. We also have death cap mushrooms to be aware of. So that is very similar to these mushrooms, you know, in appearance, but they're more of a like snot yellow, a little bit of green tinge on them. And I don't find them nearly as commonly as the destroying angel species in the Piedmont. But you need to get familiar with both of them. But the long and short is you have a mushroom that is, you know, a cap and stem deal. It's in the Amanita genus, which means that it has some sort of material at the base of the stem, and that is what's called a universal veil. So these mushrooms, the destroying angels, come up in sort of a protective little egg that is called a universal veil. And when the mushroom matures, the egg pops open, and it leaves, in the case of Amanita bisporigera, destroying angel, and also death caps, and other really poisonous amanitas, it will leave a little cut of tissue at the base of the stem. And you can see that very clearly in these photographs. And that's also why it's very important to collect the whole mushroom if you want to get an ID. Also, destroying angels, again, we have a few different species, but they're all very white, really beautiful mushrooms. So they have white gills. Oftentimes we'll have these, prominent rings on the stem of sort of delicate white tissue and white on the caps. So you want to avoid these mushrooms. You can handle them, but you should definitely not eat them. They are really, really poisonous. Okay, however, we also have some edible mushrooms. I don't eat these very often that have cups at the base. So this is Amanita section Caesariae. And basically Amanita is a genus with a lot of different species in it, and it's broken up into different sections. So the mushrooms I was just talking about, the really poisonous ones, are Amanita section Phalloideae, and that's for Amanita phalloides. That's the death cap. That's its scientific name. Amanita section Caesariae is also very common here, and they're kind of called the Caesar's mushrooms in general. So we have, a lot of them. They're very, very brightly colored. So we have the kind of the most iconic one is Amanita jacksonii, which is sort of this vermilion red color, and it has, yellowish gills and these orangey red chevrons or overlay material on a yellow stem, and then a big, almost leathery but white cup of tissue at the base of the stem. And but we have a lot of different Caesars. So if you run into ones that are bright yellow, we have Amanita beningiana and arcansana. We have Amanitas that are in the section Caesariae that are, they're numbered at this point because we don't have names for them, but they're really beautiful. Again, these bright, veiled, and when I say veil, I mean they have really, you can see it on the central picture, a big ring on the stem that's almost, in this case, this orangey sort of flamenco skirt. It's very dramatic and fun. So we see a lot of those in the summertime. All right, let's talk about one that causes severe gastrointestinal distress in some people. This is Chlorophyllum molybdites, also known as the green spored parasol mushroom. I also call it the green gilled longboob because I am childish and juvenile. Anyway, there are some people that boil and consume this mushroom. I have not done so, and I don't plan to do so because, historically, this has been listed as a toxic mushroom, and a lot of people experience really. I know one person personally who has described the experience in detail, and let me just say the icon that I selected to describe this mushroom is accurate per her description. So anyway, green spore parasols, they look very much like parasols themselves. They grow, oftentimes in lawns, and you'll see them in these big arcs and circles, fairy rings, which is essentially the perimeter of the mycelial mat. And so it's also fun when you see chlorophyllum and you'll see this big ring or arc, and it's like, wow, that is the outer perimeter of this organism. How far out is that? Because oftentimes, our world, we can focus in on a mushroom and we're like, that's the organism, and we get very small-minded about it. And so sometimes chlorophyllum is like, no, I am ginormous and I am in your yard and there's nothing you can do about it. So again, this mushroom, when consumed, can cause short-lived but bad GI upset. It has, white gills that sort of turn a greenish color as the spores mature, and the spores are sort of a greenish gray color almost. It has a little fibrous material on the cap of the on the top of the cap. You can see it's almost like little scales, and sometimes to me it looks like brown colored pencil shavings have been sort of sprinkled on the top. But you also have a darkened center, especially with the younger ones. It's like dark patch of material that as the mushroom expands, it will break apart and leave those, those scales. So sometimes it stains a little bit red, and also the green spore parasol makes my puppy Ellie very sad because that means mushroom season is coming and there will be less fetch. All right, mushroom arts and leisure. I'm going to not beat you to death with this one, but I love to paint and draw mushrooms. So here are a few of my favorites. These are species that I really enjoy eating, but also really enjoy photographing and then finding good ways to draw them and represent them. So I have the frost bolete or apple bolete, the red wrinkled flabbergaster that I was talking about earlier. That's my personal, pet name for it. We have the black trumpet mushroom, one of the best, edibles to find in this area, and a mushroom you should be looking out for right now, which is Clitosabe nuda, also known as the bluet, which is a blue, purple, brown edible mushroom that's really quite nice, and it does very well in cooler weather. And I also like to draw mushrooms that are not your sort of fleshy cap and stem dealies. So we have turkey tail, which I was showing you earlier. We also have really cool little earth star, earth ball things. So fungi, they just take so many different forms as far as their fruiting bodies, and they just tickle me pink. But I also find mushroom people to be really special. One of the things that is really encouraging to me about the study of mycology is that there are so many people who are really good citizen scientists who are very generous with their knowledge. And so, I've had the great privilege to learn and, hopefully teach other people about these amazing organisms, because they're just so mysterious and so fun. So I am going to leave you with that. I welcome any questions you might have. So I'm going to stop sharing if I can.
Anna, thank you very much. Fantastic stuff. I'm excited to see what our viewers are thinking about, what questions they have. Folks, some questions have already come in. Go ahead and type up your questions, drop them into the chat. We're going to turn to your thoughts in just a little bit. But Anna, I'm a little bit curious because you gave us some insight at the very beginning about how you got started in all of this, doing mushroom hunting in the Pacific Northwest. But what was it that just really solidified your interest and passion for finding mushrooms?
That's a good question. I think I've always enjoyed being out in nature, and so it was a very natural connection point for me. It was actually it was very random. I got asked on a date by somebody that I really ended up not liking. Like, it was a one and done date, but he's like, let's go mushroom hunting. And I love hiking. And he was going to a place that I really enjoyed. And I knew that mushroom hunting was a hobby in Oregon. So, I knew a few people who did it. And I went out, and within, 10 minutes, he was super bored and he couldn't identify anything. And he was messing around with the book. And I was just delighted. And I found some chanterelles. And so there's this, I think it's a, combination of curiosity and treasure hunting that really sparks, some delight in me.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm glad that the date didn't spoil the the outside time.
It on good terms, he was just, it's fascinating to me. Some people who are really into nature or think they will really enjoy mushroom hunting, they go out and they're like, this is not it for me. And some people, it's like, this is unexpectedly very much my kind of thing. And it's like fishing or geology, it just got its mitts on me, and I don't know why, but it really satisfies me.
I love that. That's fascinating. All right, now over here in the chat, I'm going to look over here for some questions real quick too. One of our viewers got a shout out by you on, I guess, a mycology or mushroom hunting Facebook community that you were talking about earlier. Not so much of a question. Michael wants to know, though, if you've cultivated some of the mushrooms that you've collected, if that's even possible.
Oh, that's a good question. So mushrooms that are mycorrhizal and grow in association with a tree or plant. So your chanterelles, your hydnums, your amanitas, like most of the things that I shared today, you can't cultivate because cultivating the associated tree or plant is next to impossible. So that being said, I have been able to cultivate bluet mushrooms from bluet mycelium that I've gathered in the wild. You can also cultivate oyster mushrooms, so you can gather, stem butts or mycelium. You can also very easily gather lots and lots of oyster mushroom spores from a single fruiting body and then germinate them and introduce them to some kind of growing medium. So, I've done both bluets and oyster mushrooms, but the majority of the things that are, kind of within this presentation are unfortunately beyond reach for us mere mortals.
And I know you've done some like mushroom hikes and educational things locally, like here in the Triangle, to try to get more people into it. What are other good resources for folks local? Are there classes? Are there mushroom hikes, places where they can sign up to learn more?
Yeah, I would say there is a Piedmont Mycological Society out of Winston-Salem that is active. And so they have sort of a more traditional mushroom club where they have monthly meetings and they will bring in experts and so forth. I think one of the best ways to, get involved locally is to join some of the different, different regional social media communities. And there's also a group called Mushroom Events of the USA. And even though it's a national group, anytime there's something like an open foray or, festival or large event, there are announcements there. And I do classes from time to time, but irregularly because my day job is demanding. But, and I don't know if, this is just a lack of knowledge thing. There may be folks within the Triangle who do them regularly. I don't know if somebody who has like, I'm doing mushroom classes Monday through Thursday or what have you. Also, I will mention up in the Asheville area, Alan Muscat and Taste of Home, I think is the name of his organization. So there are really good learning resources in Western Carolina, Mushroom Mountain down in South Carolina. That's Trad Cotter. They offer a wild mushroom foraging certification through, I think it's North Carolina Department of Agriculture. But they also have, a lot of learning resources and sometimes some, on-site learning experiences.
That was a lot to look into. There's a lot of resources there. All right, let's see. Here's another one. Do you think that some of the fungi you find in the woods can be useful for agriculture and forestry, such as helping to restore nutrients in barren soil for improving crop yields?
I think there is no doubt whatsoever that mycorrhizal mushroom species have a critical role to play in healthy ecosystems, including ecosystems that are, used for agriculture. So I think, out of the box, not any mushrooms, because of course your parasitic species can be very problematic, but a lot of your, mutualist mushrooms, I think are, categorically good for what their plant or tree partner happens to be. When it comes to, other applications, I've seen a lot of really interesting research around using decomposing mushrooms and their mycelium to, in particular, do things like prevent or reduce erosion, to also speed up decomposition of organic material. I am not super knowledgeable in that area. And also my understanding is that a lot of different practices come together to be effective. So, working with using, oyster mushroom mycelium and the substrate, like woody material that it is growing through, plus vermiculture, plus no-till farming, and bioswales, and like there's a lot of different, I think, practical applications. But that being said, mycelium is an incredible, it's an incredible net, a biological net. And so if you can find a way to capture and harness those properties, I think there are some really promising applications.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. Let's get into some mushroom foraging. Are there any turkey tail lookalikes that would not be good to make tea from?
Okay, so there are no turkey tail lookalikes that will be a problem for you health and safety wise. There is a species that is called Sterium, and there's a few different species of it actually. But the one that's most common is called Sterium austria, and it's also known as the parchment fungus. It is in a lot of ways, it has the variegated sort of surface like a turkey tail, but it tends to be more orangey in color, and then it picks up bits of green algae on the top. But the main difference is that underneath it is like a sort of a orangish brown and completely smooth, whereas turkey tail has a, you know, this sort of sandpapery porous surface. It wouldn't hurt you in the same way that a lot of these other, you know, polypores in general. A lot of them are woody or corky, but they are not harmful. If you were to boil them up, you could end up with a very, very bitter drink. But in general, I've never heard of something that was like a plausible, dangerous look-alike for turkey tail. And in the Piedmont, you're going to find turkey tail absolutely everywhere, and you'll find Sterium also absolutely everywhere. So you want to look at the bottoms to kind of differentiate between the two.
All right. Do mushrooms that grow on pines have an unappetizing flavor from pineness or etc. that pines produce? Pinene, excuse me. An unappetizing flavor from pinene.
Yes, as luck would have it, there are plenty of mushrooms that grow in association with pine that don't. And in general, I don't think a lot of mushrooms pick up much flavor from, you know, their associates or their surrounding habitat at all. So some of our really good edible mushrooms are pine associated. And the one thing that is, I think, can be challenging in pine areas is essentially it can be harder to find mushrooms just because pine duff can cover them up. So I spend a good bit of time in oak, like I'm an oak and beech girl, but there are some really wonderful edible mushrooms that grow with pine as well.
And given the time, this will have to be the last question. What's the best mushroom meal you've ever had?
Hard question to answer because there have been some remarkable ones, but I went to a mushroom retreat over the summer up at the Highlands Biological Station, which is part of Appalachian State, and that is in Highlands, North Carolina. And we found many, many smooth chanterelle mushrooms. So they don't have the wrinkles on them, and they're very aromatic and very, very fruity. So we had that, and then we made, like bacon out of those. That was very exciting. And then we had black trumpets with all kinds of cream sauce, and those shaggy stalked boletes with a whole lot of meat and cake and coffee and beer. So that was, I think, you know, combined with the food, but also the fact that it was one of the times that I've had a real feast of North Carolina specific mushrooms. It was very special and very fun. But yeah, that was led by Arlene and Alan Bassett, who are authors of the field guides that I also like super duper recommend and rely upon for learning and identifying mushrooms that are local. So they threw one wild party for us, and I'll never forget it.
That sounds amazing. That sounds great.
It was a good time.
Like great food and great company. When you get both of those.
That is, exactly. We had a lot to talk about. Those poor people by the end of the week. I don't know how many thousands of questions they got asked, but I'm sure they were tuckered out. But it was a real a whale of a time, as I'd like to say.
Excellent. Well, company and great science. Anna, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I hope you all have a good afternoon, and we'll see you around. Good luck with your mushroom adventures. Take care.
We'll be back here next Wednesday at noon with another presentation. So go ahead, make all the bookmarks that you need to, set your calendars, come back here to the museum's YouTube channel Wednesday at noon for another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We'll be back with another fungi presentation. So if you like this one, you'll probably want to come back next week as well. Until then, take care, stay safe, and if you get out there and find some mushrooms eventually, I hope you enjoy them and don't die. Sounds like a good way to end it. Bye, everybody.